and fake smiles, where the CIA, the KGB, European colonial empires, and corporate mercenaries all converged on a single patch of earth. The true history they don't want you to know is that the fate of the world was decided not in Washington or Moscow, but in the mineral-rich soil of a province most people couldn't find on a map. This isn't a simple story of decolonization. It's a corporate ledger written in blood, a geopolitical thriller where the bodies were real and the secrets were radioactive. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and double crosses, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right, dim the lights. This one gets messy. To understand the explosion of 1960, you have to understand the original sin. You have to go back further before the speeches and the assassinations, to the very foundation of the place. The Belgian Congo was never a colony in the traditional sense. It wasn't a project of national pride or civilizational expansion, no matter what the statues in Brussels might tell you. It began as the personal property, the private abattoir, of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. The Congo Free State, as he ironically named it, was a slave labor camp the size of Western Europe, established with the singular goal of extracting rubber and ivory. The cost was a genocide, a demographic catastrophe that may have killed 10 million people. The profits built the grand arches and avenues of Belgium. When international outrage finally forced Leopold to hand over his personal fiefdom to the Belgian state in 1908, the model didn't change. It just put on a suit and tie. The overt brutality was polished into a more insidious system of corporate control. The state administered, but the corporations ruled. And at the heart of this corporate dominion was one entity, the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, or UMHK. It was a mining conglomerate of staggering power, a state within a state that operated with near total autonomy in the southeastern province of Katanga. They built the roads, the hospitals, the schools. They paid the police. They controlled the politics. The Belgian government in faraway Leopoldville was a landlord. Union Minière was the master of the house. For decades, the world knew Union Minière for its immense copper and cobalt production. These were vital industrial metals, and they made the company and its Belgian shareholders fantastically wealthy. But beneath the official balance sheets lay a secret of unimaginable strategic importance. In a mine called Shinkolobwe, Union Minière had stumbled upon the world's richest and purest deposit of uranium ore. In the 1920s and 30s, it was a geological curiosity, used primarily for radium production. But with the dawn of the atomic age, it became the most important single spot on the planet. When Albert Einstein wrote his famous letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939, warning that Nazi Germany might be developing an atomic bomb, he specifically mentioned the Congo as the key source for the necessary raw material. The director of Union Minière, a shrewd and calculating man named Edgar Sengier, saw the writing on the wall. In 1940, with Europe on the brink of being overrun by Hitler, he made a decision that would alter the course of history. Acting without direct orders from the exiled Belgian government, Sengier secretly shipped his entire stockpile of uranium ore, over 1,200 tons of the planet's highest grade material, out of Africa. It was packed into unassuming barrels, loaded onto a freighter, and sent to a warehouse on Staten Island, New York. When the scientists of the Manhattan Project came looking for the fuel to build their bomb, they found it waiting for them, thanks to the foresight of a corporate executive protecting his most valuable asset. The bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were born in the earth of Katanga. This fact changed everything. After 1945, the Congo wasn't just a source of industrial wealth for a small European nation. It was the linchpin of American nuclear supremacy. The Shinkolobwe mine, now operating under a secret and exclusive contract with the US and British governments, became one of the most heavily guarded secrets of the Cold War. It was the beating heart of the Western nuclear arsenal. The official story was about copper. The dark truth was about the bomb. This brings us to the uncomfortable reality that governed every decision made in the years leading up to 1960. The question of Congolese independence was never about freedom or self-determination for the Belgian government or its Western allies. It was about one thing: how to change the political window dressing while ensuring at all costs that the Shinkolobwe mine and the wider Katangan mineral wealth remain securely in Western hands. Let's look at a memo that never officially existed, but whose sentiment echoed through the halls of power in Brussels and the boardrooms of Union Minière. Classified memo. 2. Minister of African Affairs, Brussels from Director of Operations, UMHK, Elizabethville. Date, October 12, 1958. Subject, the Katanga asset long-term viability. The native political consciousness is a regrettable but manageable expense. Our primary directive is not territorial administration but resource security. The material at Shinkolobwe is not merely a commodity, it is the fulcrum of global power. Future arrangements, regardless of their political label, be it colony, protectorate, or even republic, must guarantee our unhindered exclusive access. The flag flying over the governor's palace may change, but the mine, and the province it sits in, must remain functionally ours. Any native government that threatens this arrangement cannot be considered a viable partner, and that is the long-term, devastating consequence of this original sin. The very foundation of the Belgian Congo was corrupt. It wasn't built to be a nation, it was built to be a mine. Its entire economic and political infrastructure was warped around the single-minded goal of extraction, because the most valuable resource was concentrated in one province, Katanga. That province was always treated differently. It was enriched, developed, and isolated from the rest of the territory. This structure made a unified, peaceful, independent Congo a fantasy. It guaranteed that any attempt at genuine national liberation would be seen not as a political movement, but as a hostile takeover of a critical strategic asset. The fuse for the Congo Crisis was lit the moment the first gram of uranium was pulled from the earth of Shinkolobwe. Independence wasn't going to be a celebration, it was going to be a war for the control of that asset. Of partnership, of a bright future, of a historic transfer of power. But the truth, buried in the subtext of the agreements and the speed of the timeline, was far more sinister. The independence granted to the Congo was a poisoned chalice, a meticulously engineered trap designed to ensure the new nation would fail, and in failing, remain forever dependent on its former masters. The first and most damning piece of evidence is the date itself, June 30, 1960. The Belgian government, which for decades had insisted that the Congolese were not ready for self-rule, and proposed vague transition plans stretching out over 30 years, suddenly conceded to full total independence in less than 6 months. This wasn't generosity, it was strategic sabotage. A nation the size of Western Europe, with virtually no trained bureaucracy, no officer corps, and a deeply fractured political landscape, was being thrown into the deep end of the pool with its hands tied. A responsible transition would have involved years of training, institution building, and the gradual transfer of authority. This was a controlled demolition. It created an impossible timeline, guaranteeing a power vacuum, administrative chaos, and political infighting that Belgium could later exploit. And the lack of preparation was not an unfortunate oversight. It was the direct result of 80 years of deliberate Belgian policy. Consider the state of human capital in the Congo on the eve of its independence. In a population of roughly 14 million people, there were fewer than 30 Congolese university graduates. Not 30,000. 30. There were no Congolese doctors, no lawyers, no engineers, no economists. Not a single commissioned officer in the entire army, the force publique. The highest rank a Congolese soldier could achieve was sergeant major. The Belgian colonial system was never designed to build a nation. It was designed to train a workforce. It provided basic primary education to create clerks and laborers, and some missionary-run secondary schools to produce low-level functionaries. But higher education? That was forbidden. It was a system designed to create permanent dependency, to ensure that the levers of power, economic, administrative, and military, could never be grasped by the native population. So when the Congolese delegates arrived in Brussels, they were negotiating from a position of profound, manufactured weakness. They were brilliant and passionate men, Patrice Lumumba, Joseph Kasavubu, and others. But they were politicians without a state apparatus to inherit. They were being handed a flag, an anthem, and a seat at the United Nations. But every other instrument of power was being withheld. The economic terms of this independence were the final turn of the screw. Belgium magnanimously transferred political authority, but it kept the wealth. The new Congolese state was forced to inherit the massive debts incurred by the Belgian colonial administration, debts from infrastructure projects that were built primarily to serve Belgian corporate interests. Furthermore, the powerful Belgian holding companies, chief among them the Société Générale de Belgique, the financial empire that controlled Union Minière and an estimated 70% of the Congolese economy, retained all their concessions and property rights. A treaty of friendship and assistance was signed, which sounded benevolent, but in reality locked the new nation into an economic straitjacket. It ensured that profits from the mines would continue to flow to Brussels, that Belgian personnel would remain in key technical and advisory roles, and that the Congolese franc would remain tethered to the Belgian franc. It was the blueprint for neo-colonialism, a nation that was politically independent on paper, but economically, a wholly owned subsidiary of its former colonizer. This entire cynical charade is perfectly captured in the private remarks of the architects of this policy. Imagine the Belgian Minister for African Affairs, a man named Auguste de Schrijver, speaking to a closed-door meeting of industrialists and bankers in a smoke-filled room just after the conference concluded. Uncomfortable. Quote, "Gentlemen, do not mistake this for a surrender. We have not given them the Congo. We have handed them the keys to a house we still own, whose plumbing is set to burst and for which they are now responsible for the mortgage. Political independence is a cosmetic concession. We have satisfied the demands of the UN and the Americans, and we have placated their nationalists. Let them have a flag and an anthem. We will keep the vaults. Their new government will be too weak to manage, too poor to refuse our assistance, and too divided to challenge our interests in Katanga. We have not lost a colony. We have merely outsourced its administration. This is the devastating long-term consequence of the Brussels Round Table. It wasn't a moment of liberation. It was the beginning of a meticulously planned failure. The new Congolese government, which would soon be led by the charismatic and fiercely nationalist Patrice Lumumba, was being handed an impossible task. It was given a state with no money, no administrators, no army officers, and no real control over its own economy. The entire structure was designed to collapse under the slightest pressure. And when it did collapse, Belgium and its powerful corporate and international allies would be waiting in the wings, ready to restore order and protect their interests. They weren't giving the Congo its freedom. They were setting the stage for its dismemberment. The countdown to chaos had begun. Congolese leadership, men who had been political prisoners just months before, now dressed in formal attire, representing the hopes of millions. The ceremony was meant to be the final act of the carefully constructed play written in Brussels, a dignified, orderly handover confirming a continued, albeit restyled, partnership. It was supposed to be a day of polite applause and empty platitudes. Instead, it became the day the mask was ripped away, exposing the unbridgeable chasm between the mind of the colonizer and the soul of the colonized. The first to speak was King Baudouin. His speech was a masterpiece of paternalistic delusion. He did not speak of a right that had been won through struggle. He spoke of a gift that was being granted by a benevolent superior. He lectured the new Congolese government on the challenges ahead, warning them against hasty reforms and reminding them not to compromise the institutions Belgium had so generously built for them. Then, in an act of breathtaking historical whitewashing, he paid tribute to the genius of his great-granduncle, King Leopold II. He presented the architect of the Congo Free State's Holocaust not as a tyrant, but as a visionary, the first civilizer of the land. He spoke of the Belgian colonial project as a noble mission, a fight against disease, poverty, and Arab slave traders, conveniently omitting the forced labor, the severed hands, and the systemic exploitation that had defined it. For the Belgians in the room, it was a moment of self-congratulation. For the Congolese, it was a profound collective insult, a demand that they be grateful for their own subjugation. Next came the new president, Joseph Kasavubu, His speech was exactly what the Belgians had expected and desired. It was formal, diplomatic, and deeply conciliatory. He thanked the king, praised Belgium for its guidance, and spoke of a future of mutual respect and cooperation. He played his part in the charade perfectly. He was the responsible native, the moderate leader with whom the West could do business. For a few brief moments, it seemed the carefully managed script would hold. The ceremony would conclude and the neo-colonial project would proceed as planned. But then, an unscheduled event occurred. The new Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, strode to the podium. He had not been invited to speak, but he would not be silenced. And what came next was not a speech. It was a political eruption. It was the raw, unvarnished, and furious voice of 80 years of humiliation. Lumumba did not thank Belgium. He did not praise the king. He turned directly to his own people and spoke a truth that had never before been uttered in such a forum. He spoke of independence not as a gift from Brussels, but as a victory won through tears, fire, and blood. He directly refuted Baudouin's fantasy narrative. "We have known," he declared, his voice ringing with passion, "that our lands were spoiled in the name of supposedly legal laws, which only recognized the right of the strongest. We have known the law was never the same for the white and the black." He spoke of the ironies, the insults, the blows they were forced to endure morning, noon, and night because we were Negroes. He reminded the world of the segregated cities, the expropriated lands, and the political prisoners. It was a searing indictment of the entire colonial project, delivered directly to the face of the colonizing monarch. For the Congolese in the room, it was an electrifying moment of catharsis, of long-suppressed truth finally being unleashed. For the Belgians and for the Western diplomats watching, it was an act of blasphemy. It was a declaration of war against the established order. The fallout was immediate. The king was visibly stunned. The Belgian delegation was apoplectic. This was not the deal. This was not the polite, manageable independence they had engineered. This was a man they could not control, a man who refused to forget the past or forgive their sins. Consider the urgent coded cable that a CIA officer, posing as a diplomat in the audience, would have sent back to Langley, Virginia, just moments later. Uncomfortable quote to DDP, Deputy Director of Plans. From Station Chief, Leopoldville, Eyes Only. Subject, Independence Day Ceremony Assessment. Event, Congolese Independence Ceremony. King Baudouin's address was standard, Kasavubu, predictable. But the Prime Minister, Lumumba, delivered an unscheduled tirade. It was pure, unfiltered nationalist vitriol. He did not speak of partnership. He spoke of retribution. He has publicly rejected the script we wrote for him. He is not just a radical. He represents an active and immediate threat to all Western strategic interests in this country, including the Katanga concessions. Recommend immediate reassessment of our engagement strategy with his government. This man is a problem that will not be solved through diplomatic channels. And this was the catastrophic long-term consequence of that day. In the space of 10 minutes, Patrice Lumumba transformed himself in the eyes of the West. He was no longer just a difficult nationalist they had to manage. He was now perceived as a dangerous, unpredictable radical, a potential African Castro, who threatened to tear up the economic agreements that guaranteed Western access to the Congo's strategic minerals. His speech was interpreted not as a legitimate expression of post-colonial grievance, but as a sign of pro-Soviet alignment. It confirmed every fear harbored in Washington, Brussels, and London. The battle lines were no longer hidden in the fine print of treaties. They were drawn in public on the world stage. The day that was meant to inaugurate a new era of peaceful, controlled neo-colonialism instead became the day the powerful machinery of the West began to turn against Congo's first and only democratically elected leader. His fate was effectively sealed at that podium, justification for external intervention. This wasn't a random event. It was the predictable and perhaps even desired collapse of a pillar that was built to fail. To understand the mutiny, you have to understand the force publique. This was not a national army in any recognizable sense. It had never been intended to defend the Congo's borders or serve its people. For 80 years, it was a colonial tool of repression, a brutal internal security force used to terrorize the Congolese population into submission on behalf of the Belgian state and its corporate partners. Its ranks were filled with Congolese soldiers, often forcibly conscripted from different regions and deliberately pitted against each other to prevent unity. But its entire officer corps, from the lowest lieutenant to the commander-in-chief, was exclusively and inflexibly white and Belgian. Congolese soldiers were subjected to relentless abuse, racial segregation, and humiliating discipline. They were the muscle of the colonial machine, but they were never allowed to be its mind. Independence Day was supposed to change all that. For the 24,000 Congolese soldiers of the Force Publique, it was a moment of profound expectation. They anticipated not just a new flag, but a new reality. Promotions, pay raises, and most importantly, the dignity of serving under their own Congolese officers. They expected the Africanization of the army to mirror the Africanization of the government. They were tragically mistaken. The Belgian commander of the army, a rigid and unapologetic colonialist named Lieutenant General Emile Janssens, saw no reason for things to change. On July 5, 1960, at the main military base just outside Leopoldville, General Janssens assembled his Congolese troops to address their growing discontent. His method was not one of reassurance or diplomacy. It was an act of pure, unadulterated colonial arrogance. He strode to a blackboard and in large chalk letters wrote a simple, world-shattering equation. Avant independence, Chaos, après independence. Before independence, contraus, after independence. This was it. This was the ultimate confirmation that the entire promise of liberation was a fraud. It was a declaration, from the mouth of their own commander, that their status as subjugated inferiors was permanent. The reaction was not just anger, it was combustion. The soldiers mutinied. They renounced their white officers, chased them from the barracks, and seized armories. The mutiny spread like wildfire across the country. It was an explosion of pent-up rage against decades of systematic abuse. And, predictably, it turned ugly. Some Belgian officers and their families were attacked and humiliated. The chaos began to spiral. Patrice Lumumba's government, barely 5 days old, was thrown into a desperate crisis. Lumumba acted with surprising speed. He immediately dismissed General Janssens. He agreed to the soldiers' demands, authorizing a full Africanization of the officer corps. He promoted every single Congolese soldier by one rank. He appointed a new Congolese commander, Victor Lundula, and in a move that would have monumental consequences, he named a disciplined, ambitious former sergeant major as the Army's chief of staff, Joseph Désiré Mobutu. These were the logical, rational steps of a leader trying to regain control of his nation's security forces. But the Belgians, and the wider Western world, were not interested in seeing him succeed. The Belgian press and much of the international media seized upon the most sensationalist stories of the chaos. They painted a picture of a nation descending into savage anti-white anarchy, of a complete breakdown of civilization. Reports, many of them wildly exaggerated or fabricated, of widespread rape and murder of Europeans filled the airwaves and newspapers. Panic set in among the 100,000 Belgian civilians still living in the Congo. This panic was not just a byproduct of the chaos, it was a tool. It created the pretext that the Belgian government had been waiting for. Consider this fictionalized but representative cable, sent from the Belgian embassy in Leopoldville to the crisis group at the Foreign Ministry in Brussels. Classified memo to Minister of Foreign Affairs, Brussels, from Ambassador Jean van den Bosch, Leopoldville, date July 8, 1960. Subject, security situation. Update, pretext confirmed. The anticipated breakdown of discipline within the Force Publique has occurred, as projected. General Janssens' final provocation was remarkably effective. Widespread and sustained panic among the European population is being reported, amplified by our press contacts. Lumumba's government is patently unable to guarantee safety. This constitutes the casus belli we required. Recommend immediate deployment of metropolitan paratroopers under the public pretext of a humanitarian intervention to protect Belgian nationals. This will allow us to secure key economic assets, particularly in Katanga, and bypass the authority of the Lumumba government entirely. The plan is proceeding. This is the truly devastating consequence of the mutiny. It was a crisis born directly from Belgium's own racist and exploitative colonial policies. Yet, it was expertly framed as a failure of the new, independent Congolese government. It delegitimized Patrice Lumumba on the world stage, painting him as an incompetent radical who couldn't even control his own army just days after he took office. More importantly, it provided the perfect, unimpeachable humanitarian excuse for Belgium to do what it had likely intended to do all along: reinvade its former colony, seize control of the valuable territory, and deal with the problem of Patrice Lumumba once and for all. The chaos wasn't an unforeseen tragedy. It was the trigger for a trap that had been set months earlier in Brussels. This was not a negotiated assistance program. It was an invasion. It was a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of a nation that had been independent for precisely 10 days. The official justification, repeated in urgent addresses in Brussels and at the United Nations, was humanitarian. The operational reality was a brutal and calculated act of neo-colonial reconquest, designed not to save lives, but to secure assets and break the country in two. The humanitarian cover story was plausible only to the willfully naive. The pattern of deployment revealed the true mission. While some troops did secure evacuation points for Belgian civilians, the main thrust of the operation was strategic, not humanitarian. The paratroopers seized airports, ports, and communication hubs. They landed in force in Leopoldville, surrounding government buildings and effectively placing the capital under foreign military occupation. Lumumba's government, which had not requested or approved this intervention, was rendered powerless, a sovereign entity unable to control its own territory. The Belgians weren't there to help his government restore order. They were there to impose their own. But the most critical deployment, the one that exposed the entire conspiracy, was in the southeastern province of Katanga. On that same day, July 10th, Belgian troops poured into Elizabethville, the provincial capital and the corporate headquarters of the mighty Union Minière. Their actions here had nothing to do with rescuing panicked civilians. Their first priority was to disarm the units of the Force Publique stationed in the province. These Congolese soldiers, while part of the broader mutiny, were the only military force in the region loyal to Patrice Lumumba's central government. The Belgian paratroopers swiftly and ruthlessly neutralized them, seizing their weapons and confining them to barracks. In a single stroke, they had eliminated the central government's ability to project power into its own most vital province. With the Congolese army neutralized, the Belgian forces fanned out to secure the real prize: the vast industrial empire of Union Minière. They established armed perimeters around the mines at Kolwezi, the cobalt refineries, the hydroelectric dams, and the railway lines that transported the mineral wealth to the sea. This was not a rescue mission. This was a corporate security operation on a national scale. They were creating a military shield, a safe zone, not for fleeing Europeans, but for the continued, uninterrupted extraction of copper, cobalt, and the all-important uranium. And behind this shield, a new political reality was being born. The Belgians weren't just acting as corporate security guards, they were kingmakers. Their chosen king was the provincial president of Katanga, a man named Moise Tshombe. Tshombe was everything Patrice Lumumba was not: conservative, pro-business, and deeply entwined with Belgian corporate interests. He was a wealthy politician whose power base was built on his close relationship with Union Minière. For months, Brussels and the executives of UMHK had cultivated him as their man, the perfect leader for a separate client state of Katanga that would remain firmly within the Western economic orbit. The arrival of the Belgian paratroopers was his green light. It was the signal that he could now act with impunity, secure in the knowledge that the military power of a European nation was at his back. Let's look at the kind of directive that would have been read to the Belgian commanders just before they boarded their transport planes. It wouldn't have been written down in a form for public consumption, but its cold logic was unmistakable. Classified memo reference: Operation Piranha Priority Objectives, Katanga Sector Orders for Colonel B.E.M. Guy Weber, 1st Parachute Battalion. Directive: Your primary objective upon securing Elizabethville Airfield is not mass civilian evacuation. It is the immediate neutralization of all Force Publique elements loyal to the central government. Seize their armories and command posts. Once neutralized, establish a protective cordon around all UMHK installations and provincial government buildings. Your presence is to provide Governor Chombe and his cabinet with the necessary security assurances to proceed with their anticipated political declaration. Public posture remains strictly humanitarian. Operational reality is the stabilization of the provincial authority structure. Acknowledge. The devastating long-term consequence of this action cannot be overstated. This was the ultimate betrayal. Belgium, the former colonial power, used the pretext of the chaos it had helped create to invade and dismember the very nation it had just liberated. This act of aggression destroyed Patrice Lumumba's authority, making him look like a leader who could neither control his army nor defend his nation's borders. It intentionally radicalized the situation, pushing Lumumba to seek help from any quarter, which would further alienate him from the West. And most critically, it provided the military muscle for the next and most fateful step in the plan: the formal secession of the Congo's richest province. The paratroopers weren't peacekeepers. They were the armed midwives attending the birth of a corporate puppet state. Casual observer, it might have looked like a legitimate expression of regional self-determination, a local leader breaking away from the chaos engulfing the capital. But this was no popular uprising. This was a coup d'etat, executed not by generals in a palace but by executives in a boardroom in Brussels. The secession of Katanga was a business decision, designed, financed, and managed by Union Minière to keep its vast mineral wealth out of the hands of a nationalist African government. Moïse Tshombe was the perfect frontman for this operation. He was the public face, the plausible African leader who could sell the story of Katanga's independence to the world. But the strings were being pulled by a trinity of European power. First and foremost was Union Minière itself. The company immediately became the financial lifeblood of the new nation. In a move of breathtaking audacity, UMHK announced it would no longer pay its taxes, royalties, and export duties to the central government in Leopoldville. Instead, these vast sums, which accounted for nearly 60% of the entire Congolese national budget, were diverted directly into Moïse Tshombe's newly established treasury. This single act of financial warfare was designed to bankrupt Lumumba's government, to starve it into submission. The money that should have been building schools and roads for the entire Congo was now paying for the government, the diplomats, and the army of a corporate statelet. The second part of the trinity was the Belgian government. While officially claiming neutrality and denying any role in the secession, Belgium's actions told a different story. The secession was followed by a quiet but massive influx of Belgian technicians and advisors to help Tshombe build his new state. Experienced Belgian civil servants conveniently resigned from their posts in Brussels, only to reappear days later in Elizabethville as key ministers in Tshombe's government, running the finances, the foreign affairs, the justice system. It was a seamless transfer of a colonial administration, just under a new, locally branded flag. Nowhere was this direct Belgian involvement more obvious than in the creation of Katanga's military, the gendarmerie. This was not a hastily assembled militia. It was a professional fighting force created, armed, trained, and led by active-duty Belgian military officers who were seconded to Tshombe's service. They took the Congolese soldiers in Katanga, who had been disarmed by the paratroopers, rearmed them, and forged them into a loyal private army. Its sole purpose was to defend the secessionist state and, by extension, Union Minière's property from any attempt by the central government to reclaim its territory. The state of Katanga now had its own flag, its own money, and its own Belgian-led army. It was a colony in all but name. The cold financial logic behind this entire affair is laid bare in the internal communications of Union Minière. While no formal minutes were ever leaked, the substance of their discussions at the time is not hard to deduce. Classified memo excerpt from the minutes of the UMHK Executive Committee, Brussels date, July 15, 1960. Subject, Item 7, Fiscal Realignment Post-Declaration of Katangan Independence. The chairman confirms that all tax and royalty payments previously rendered to the Leopoldville administration are to be suspended indefinitely, effective immediately. A preliminary advance of 1.25 billion Belgian francs debited against future tax obligations, will be transferred to the newly chartered National Bank of Katanga to cover initial state building expenditures, including security force salaries and foreign representation. Monsieur Chombe has provided full assurances that all existing UMHK mining concessions will be honored in perpetuity under the new constitution. The political risk to our core assets is now considered mitigated. In effect, we are no longer tenants in a hostile environment. We are now partners with the landlord. The dividend forecast for Q4 is revised upwards accordingly. This is the devastating, enduring legacy of Katanga's secession. It was the perfection of a new model of colonialism. It demonstrated that a powerful corporation, with the clandestine backing of its home government, could literally manufacture a country to protect its bottom line. The Declaration of Independence was not a political document. It was a corporate restructuring, a way to legally shield assets from a national government deemed hostile to shareholder interests. This act guaranteed that the Congo Crisis would escalate from a political dispute into a full-blown war. Patrice Lumumba, his country dismembered and his treasury empty, now had no choice but to try and reclaim the stolen, beating heart of his nation by any means necessary. The boardroom coup in Katanga had just made a battlefield of the entire Congo, to the international community to uphold the law, to defend his nation's sovereignty, and to help him expel the Belgian invaders and crush the secession. But in his desperate gambit for help, Patrice Lumumba was about to learn a terrible lesson. When a nation's freedom conflicts with the world's most powerful financial and strategic interests, the world is already invested in its failure. His first appeal was not to the East, it was to the West. Lumumba was an African nationalist, not a doctrinaire communist. He believed, perhaps naively, in the principles of international law and the supposed anti-colonial stance of the United States. He formally requested American aid. He met with the U.S. ambassador in Leopoldville, Claire Timberlake, and laid out his case. A NATO ally, Belgium, had committed an act of aggression against his country. It was backing a secession designed to steal the Congo's wealth. He asked for American assistance to restore order and reunify the nation. He was essentially asking the United States to live up to its own professed ideals. The response from the Eisenhower administration was a masterclass in diplomatic stonewalling. Publicly, they expressed deep concern and urged all parties to show restraint. They deferred to the United Nations as the proper venue for resolving the crisis. But privately, in the cold, pragmatic corridors of the White House and the CIA, the calculus was entirely different. They had already pegged Lumumba as a potential Castro, a dangerous radical whose fiery independence speech, remember that, had set off every alarm bell. Moise Chombe, in contrast, was a known quantity. A conservative, pro-business leader who would guarantee that Katanga's strategic minerals continued to flow exclusively to the West. Helping Lumumba crush Chombe was the last thing they wanted to do. It would mean helping a suspected leftist reunify a country whose most valuable asset was currently in the hands of a reliable friend. So they did nothing. They offered sympathy, but not a single bullet, not a single dollar, not a single drop of fuel. Rebuffed by Washington, Lumumba placed all his hope in the United Nations. On July 12th, he and President Kasavubu sent a formal request to Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. Their demands were precise and unambiguous. They requested urgent UN military assistance for two specific purposes. First, to protect the national territory of the Congo against the external aggression posed by Belgian troops. Second, to help the legitimate government restore internal order, which explicitly meant ending the illegal secession of Katanga. This was a clear appeal for the UN to enforce its own charter, to defend a member state from invasion and dismemberment. The UN Security Council acted with surprising speed. On July 14th, it passed Resolution 143, authorizing the creation of a peacekeeping force, the Opération des Nations Unies au Congo, or ONUC. Blue-helmeted soldiers from around the world would soon begin arriving. To Lumumba, it must have seemed like a victory, a sign that the world would not stand by and watch his country be destroyed. But the victory was hollow. The resolution contained a fatal, deliberately engineered flaw. At the insistence of the United States, Britain, and France, all of whom had deep ties to the financial interests in Katanga, a key clause was inserted. The UN force was authorized to use force only in self-defense. It was explicitly forbidden from intervening in what the Western powers disingenuously framed as an internal political conflict, namely, the Katanga secession. Let us listen in on a conversation that would have taken place in the Oval Office at the time, between a frustrated president and his ruthlessly clear-eyed intelligence chief. Uncomfortable quote. President Eisenhower. So Alan, this man Lumumba is still screaming for our help to take back the mines. CIA Director Alan Dulles. He is, Mr. President, and he's got the UN involved now. The Belgians have made a mess, but it's a useful mess. Chombe is predictable. He's on the payroll one way or another. Lumumba is a genuine unknown, and he's leaning the wrong way. Eisenhower. Then the answer remains a firm no. We make sympathetic noises, we push this whole disaster onto Hammarskjöld's desk, and we make damn sure his blue helmets have their hands tied. Let Lumumba stew. Under no circumstances are we to actively help this man reunify that country. Let's just see who he talks to next. I have a feeling he'll make our decision for us, and that was the devastating consequence of this global response. It was a perfectly executed diplomatic trap. The West, which had the power to solve the crisis by simply telling Belgium to back off, refused to act. The United Nations, which should have been Lumumba's salvation, was transformed into an instrument of his containment. The UN peacekeepers arrived not to end the secession, but to freeze it in place, to act as a buffer between Katanga and the central government, effectively legitimizing the breakaway state's existence. Lumumba was cornered. The so-called free world had systematically denied him every legitimate avenue for assistance. His nation was occupied, its treasury was empty, and his authority was evaporating. He was left with one final, desperate, and fateful option. If the West wouldn't help him, perhaps the East would. The West didn't just ignore his pleas. They manufactured the very conditions that would allow them to brand him an enemy. Having exhausted every diplomatic channel in Washington, London, and at the UN, Patrice Lumumba formally requested technical and logistical assistance from the Soviet Union. This was not an ideological conversion. Lumumba was not a communist, and there is no credible evidence he ever intended to turn the Congo into a Soviet satellite state. This was a purely pragmatic, nationalist calculation. He had a legitimate, UN-recognized government, and a province in open illegal rebellion, propped up by foreign troops and money. His own army, the Force Publique, was in disarray and had no capacity to mount a major operation to retake Katanga. He desperately needed transport aircraft to move his loyal troops across the vast distances of his country. The Americans had refused. The UN was forbidden from helping. So he asked the only other power with the resources to do so, the USSR. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Lumumba's request was a gift from the geopolitical gods. At a minimal cost, he could leapfrog Western containment policy and establish a Soviet presence right in the heart of Africa. It was a chance to champion the cause of anti-colonialism, embarrass NATO, and potentially gain influence over a nation of immense strategic value. The Kremlin's response was swift and positive. They didn't send an army, but they sent exactly what Lumumba had asked for. A handful of Ilyushin-14 transport planes arrived, along with around 100 Soviet military trucks, a small cache of weapons, and a few dozen technicians and advisors to operate the equipment. From Moscow's perspective, it was a low-risk probe. From Washington's perspective, it was the apocalypse. The arrival of Soviet aircraft and personnel in the Congo triggered a full-blown panic within the Eisenhower administration. All the carefully constructed nuance of the situation, that Lumumba had begged the West for help first, that his goal was nationalist reunification, not communist revolution, was instantly incinerated in a firestorm of Cold War paranoia. The CIA station in Leopoldville began sending frantic cables back to Langley. The Ilyushin planes were seen not as mere transport, but as the vanguard of a Soviet takeover. Lumumba was no longer a potential Castro. He was now, in their eyes, a confirmed Soviet puppet who had willingly opened the door to the KGB. The fear went far beyond the Congo itself. It tapped into the deepest anxieties of Cold War doctrine, the domino theory. A Soviet-aligned Congo, with its vast size and central location, could become a base for spreading communist influence throughout the continent. And then there was the ultimate nightmare, the secret that underscored the entire crisis, the callback to the Congo's original sin. The Soviets would potentially gain access to the Shinkolobwe mine's uranium reserves. The very material that had given America its nuclear supremacy could fall into the hands of its mortal enemy. The stakes had just escalated from regional stability to global nuclear balance. This paranoia is perfectly captured in the tone of the Emergency National Security Council meetings that took place in Washington in August 1960. The CIA director, Allen Dulles, a man who saw the world as a grand chessboard of covert operations, would have framed the situation in the starkest possible terms to the president. Uncomfortable, quote CIA Director Allen Dulles, "Mr. President, the situation has now critically escalated. Lumumba has openly invited the Soviet Union into Central Africa. We have confirmed Ilyushin military transports on the ground in Leopoldville, crewed by their personnel. This is no longer about a chaotic decolonization. This is a classic KGB playbook operation to seize control of the continent's most strategic territory. We are potentially looking at a Soviet-backed republic in possession of the world's richest, unsecured uranium deposits. The time for containment and diplomatic management has passed. We must now urgently consider more permanent and decisive solutions." And this was the fatal, devastating consequence of Lumumba's decision. His desperate, pragmatic plea for help was willfully and deliberately misinterpreted as an act of ideological warfare. By playing the Soviet card, the only card the West had left him, he gave his enemies the perfect, unimpeachable justification to move from simply containing and undermining him to actively plotting his elimination. He had walked, eyes open, into a trap they had set for him. His acceptance of Soviet aid wasn't the proof of his communism, it was the signing of his own death warrant, because it allowed the CIA and the White House to reframe a messy African nationalist struggle as a black and white, life-or-death battle in the Cold War. A battle that, in their minds, America absolutely could not afford to lose. The question was no longer if Lumumba should be removed from power, but how. They were fighting a ghost. Because while the CIA was frantically drawing up plans to stop the Soviets from getting their hands on the Congo's uranium, they seemed to have missed one crucial hidden fact: the uranium was already gone. This is one of the deepest and most cynical secrets of the entire Congo crisis. To understand it, we have to go back to the Shinkolobwe mine. As we established, this was the geological treasure chest that fueled the Manhattan Project and the early American nuclear arsenal. But by the late 1950s, the incredibly rich veins of pitchblende were largely exhausted. In 1959, Union Miniere officially announced that the mine was depleted and no longer commercially viable. They ceremonially shut it down, removed the equipment, and allowed the deep shafts to flood with groundwater. To the outside world, the story of Shinkolobwe was over. Its strategic role in history was finished. This was a carefully crafted lie. While the raw ore in the ground may have been gone, what remained above ground was arguably even more valuable. For years, Union Miniere had been processing and refining the ore on site, creating a massive, closely guarded stockpile of high-grade uranium concentrate or yellowcake. This wasn't raw rock. This was the direct feedstock for nuclear reactors and weapons. It was thousands of tons of material that represented the crown jewels of the Western world's nuclear program. And as the drumbeat for Congolese independence grew louder in 1959 and early 1960, the men in the boardrooms of Union Miniere and the government offices in Brussels faced a terrifying prospect. This atomic stockpile was about to be inherited by a new, unpredictable African government. They were not about to let that happen. In the final months before the handover on June 30, 1960, Union Miniere, almost certainly with the full knowledge and blessing of the Belgian government and the American Combined Development Agency, executed a covert corporate smuggling operation of breathtaking scale. While the world's media was focused on the political negotiations in Brussels, a fleet of trains and trucks began quietly moving out of Katanga. On the official shipping manifests, it was all business as usual. Tons of copper ingots, sacks of cobalt concentrate, bound for the Angolan port of Lobito. But mixed in with these legitimate shipments, hidden in plain sight in identical barrels and containers, was the entire remaining Shinkolobwe stockpile. It was the perfect crime, executed with the ruthless efficiency of a multinational corporation. Union Miniere controlled the entire logistics chain: the mines, the refineries, the railways, the port facilities. There were no outside customs inspectors to ask difficult questions. There were no independent auditors. It was a closed system. The barrels of yellowcake were blended into the vast river of minerals that constantly flowed out of Katanga, a few tons at a time, hidden within the statistical noise of the world's largest mining operation. By the time King Baudouin stood up to give his condescending independence speech, the vault was empty. The strategic asset had been spirited away. This clandestine operation is the kind of thing that is never committed to paper, except in the most deniable and cryptic of terms. Imagine a telex sent from the highest level in Brussels to the site director in Katanga, a man whose entire career was built on loyalty and discretion. Classified Memo 2, Evil OPS Director from Baru HQ Exec. Date 02 Feb 1960. Subject Final Site Decommissioning Directive Gamma. Reference our last conversation. You are to accelerate the drawdown of all remaining processed material at O site or site. Disperse all shipments via standard logistics channels, blended with regular copper-cobalt production manifests. No special records, separate ledgers, or unique bills of lading are to be created for this process. The public narrative remains the flooding of the primary shaft for safety reasons. The emptying of the warehouses is an internal matter of corporate prudence and risk mitigation prior to the June 30th transition. Your objective is a zero balance sheet by June 15th. Acknowledge and destroy this communication immediately upon receipt. This is the devastating, uncomfortable reality that sits beneath the public narrative of the Cold War panic. The entire frenzy in Washington over Lumumba giving the Soviets uranium was, in large part, a paranoid fantasy. The West was terrified he would give away a prize they had already secretly stolen. This secret preemptive removal of the stockpile reveals the absolute core cynicism of the entire decolonization process. It shows that the Western powers never, for a single moment, trusted the new Congolese state or intended for it to exercise sovereignty over its own most critical resources. They were rigging the game before the first card was even dealt. The crime had already been committed, quietly and efficiently, not by politicians or spies in trench coats, but by men in suits, signing shipping manifests, with a mandate to restore order. But the men on the ground, the thousands of blue-helmeted soldiers from a score of nations, would soon discover that their mission was a lie. They were not there as impartial arbiters. They were there as pawns, sent to manage a crisis that was being actively engineered and prolonged by the very powers that had sent them. At the center of this impossible task was the UN Secretary-General, Dag Hammarskjöld. A Swedish diplomat of immense personal integrity and ascetic dedication, Hammarskjöld was a true believer in the power and moral authority of the United Nations. He saw the Congo Crisis as the UN's most vital test, a chance to prove that the international community could protect a new, vulnerable nation from the predatory instincts of the old colonial powers. He threw himself into the mission with relentless energy, personally flying to the Congo to oversee the deployment of his peacekeeping force, the ONUC. He believed he could succeed. He was, tragically, wrong. The entire UN operation was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. The mandate handed to Hammarskjöld by the Security Council was a masterpiece of diplomatic schizophrenia, a document that ordered him to achieve two mutually exclusive goals. On one hand, at the insistence of the African and non-aligned nations, the mandate called for the complete withdrawal of Belgian troops and the restoration of the Congo's territorial integrity. This, in plain language, meant helping Lumumba's government end the Katanga secession. On the other hand, at the rigid insistence of the United States, Britain, and France, the mandate forbade the UN from using force except in self-defense and from intervening in the internal affairs of the Congo. This, in plain language, meant the UN could not take action to end the Katanga secession. It was an impossible, paradoxical mission. Hammarskjöld was commanded to put a country back together, but he was forbidden from using any of the tools required for the job. He was being asked to be impartial between a legally constituted, democratically elected government and a corporate-funded, foreign-backed rebellion. The UN troops on the ground were caught in this political crossfire. They were stationed throughout the country, a thin blue line in a sea of chaos. They were resented by Lumumba's government, who saw them as a useless occupying force that refused to help them fight the secessionists. They were viewed with suspicion by Tshombe and his Belgian advisors, who saw them as a potential threat to their new state. They were often obstructed by the very Belgian troops they were supposed to be replacing. They were peacekeepers in a war zone where the major powers had no interest in peace. This futility was personified by Hammarskjöld's first special representative in the Congo, the distinguished American diplomat and Nobel Peace Prize winner, Dr. Ralph Bunche. Bunche arrived with enormous prestige but quickly found himself powerless. He negotiated endlessly for the withdrawal of Belgian troops from Katanga, only to be met with delays, excuses, and outright refusal. He could not provide Lumumba with the logistical support he needed, as this would be seen as taking sides. He was a fireman who was forbidden from using water on the main source of the blaze. The immense strain and disillusionment of this impossible task must have weighed heavily on Dag Hammarskjöld. One can imagine him, late at night in his office on the 38th floor of the UN building in New York, confiding his frustrations in a private journal entry. Uncomfortable quote from the private papers of a UN diplomat: "The Congo mandate is a puzzle box with no solution. The Security Council has tasked me with reunifying a nation, while simultaneously forbidding me from taking any action against the very forces orchestrating its division. I am told to be impartial between a legitimate government and a rebellion openly funded and staffed by a member state's citizens. They have given me a surgeon's scalpel and told me to perform major surgery on a hemorrhaging patient, but have forbidden me from making an incision. I fly to Leopoldville, and Lumumba accuses me of protecting Tshombe. I speak to Tshombe, and he accuses me of being Lumumba's pawn. The truth is, we are pawns in their much larger game. I fear we are not here as peacekeepers. We are here as custodians of a crisis they wish to prolong." And this was the devastating long-term consequence. The United Nations, the world's greatest symbol of collective security and international law, was co-opted and perverted into an instrument of paralysis. The presence of the blue helmets created a perfect alibi for Western inaction. Why should the US act when the UN was on the ground? But the UN's hands were tied. In effect, the ONUC force became the de facto border guard for the state of Katanga. By positioning themselves between Lumumba's forces and the secessionist province, they inadvertently protected the rebellion. The UN mission, born of Hammarskjöld's highest ideals, became a crucial, functional part of the cynical Western strategy to contain Lumumba and bleed his government dry. It was a betrayal not just of the Congo, but of the very principles the United Nations was founded to defend. Patrice Lumumba was now officially designated a threat to the national security of the United States. And for a threat of that magnitude, a more permanent solution was required. That solution was formally, if not explicitly, authorized in the sterile, air-conditioned confines of the cabinet room at the White House. The date was August 18, 1960. President Dwight D. Eisenhower convened a meeting of his National Security Council. The mood was grim. The administration was still reeling from the international humiliation of the U-2 spy plane affair, where an American pilot had been shot down and captured deep inside the Soviet Union. Eisenhower, the fabled war hero, had been caught in a lie on the world stage. The last thing he or his administration could afford was to look weak or indecisive in the face of another perceived Soviet advance. And into this charged atmosphere, CIA Director Allen Dulles came to deliver his verdict on the Congo. Dulles, the master spy, the architect of coups in Iran and Guatemala, laid out his case against Patrice Lumumba. He would have spoken in calm, measured tones, but his words would have painted a picture of imminent doom. He presented Lumumba's acceptance of Soviet aid not as the desperate act of a cornered nationalist, but as the final, irrefutable proof of a malignant pro-Soviet allegiance. He would have used the loaded, inflammatory language of the era, comparing Lumumba's anti-colonial rhetoric to that of Fidel Castro in Cuba, a comparison designed to provoke maximum alarm. He was framing Lumumba not as a political leader, but as a virus, a cancer that, if left unchecked, would metastasize throughout Central Africa, delivering the continent's strategic mineral wealth and its unspoken uranium prize directly into the hands of the Kremlin. What happened next has been debated by historians for decades, sanitized in official records, and shrouded in the deliberate ambiguity of plausible deniability. But according to the declassified notes of Robert H. Johnson, the council's minute taker, a clear and chilling consensus was reached. As Dulles concluded his grim assessment, President Eisenhower, a man known for his temperate public persona, made his feelings brutally clear. He did not write a formal order. He did not sign a presidential finding. He did something far more effective and far more deniable. Let's reconstruct that pivotal, horrifying moment from the fragmented records and testimony that have since come to light. Uncomfortable quote. Reconstructed verbatim exchange, NSC meeting, August 18, 1960. Subject, Congo. Alan Dulles. And so, in conclusion, Mr. President, Lumumba remains propped up by Soviet logistics. He is actively preparing to move against Katanga, which will collapse the entire pro-Western position there. He is simply put a cancer, and if left unchecked, he will metastasize. President Eisenhower. Leaning forward, his voice reportedly low and sharp. The frustrations of this whole affair are just immense. We are talking about one man. One single man is causing all of this trouble. A heavy silence falls over the room. The president looks directly at Alan Dulles, the one man in the room whose job it is to make problems disappear. President Eisenhower, I wish he would fall into a river full of crocodiles. Another beat of silence. The implication hangs in the air, thick and undeniable. National Security Advisor Gordon Gray. Mr. President, are we entirely sure that the diplomatic options have been? President Eisenhower, cutting him off. We've discussed it enough. Let's move on. What's the situation in Laos? For decades, officials would claim the president was merely venting, expressing frustration in a colorful metaphor. This is a deliberate, cynical misreading of how power works in the shadows. In the coded world of espionage and covert action, a president does not need to issue a written directive for an assassination. When the commander-in-chief looks at his director of Central Intelligence and expresses a clear, violent wish for the removal of a foreign leader, that is not a suggestion. It is a command. Alan Dulles left that meeting with what he and everyone else in that room understood to be full presidential authorization to arrange for the permanent elimination of Patrice Lumumba. This was the devastating, irreversible consequence of that meeting. The policy of the United States of America was no longer containment. It was no longer political maneuvering. It was state-sponsored murder. The full, formidable, and clandestine apparatus of the Central Intelligence Agency, its scientists, its paymasters, its agents, its assassins, was now aimed squarely at one man. The geopolitical chess game had just become a manhunt. But in the world of high-stakes espionage, the method is everything. A bullet is crude, messy, and it points to a gunman. A car bomb is loud and indiscriminate. For a target of this profile, the CIA wanted a death that was quiet, clinical, and above all, completely and utterly deniable. The hunt was on, and the chosen weapon would not be an explosive but a poison. To procure this weapon, the agency turned to its own master of the dark arts, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was the head of the CIA's technical services staff, a brilliant chemist with a doctorate from Caltech who presided over the agency's most notorious and secret program, MK-Ultra. He was the man the CIA turned to for truth serums, mind control experiments, and of course deadly toxins. He was a real-life Q, but his gadgets weren't for a fictional super spy. They were instruments of state-sponsored murder. Operating from a clandestine laboratory, Gottlieb developed a biological agent specifically for the Lumumba assignment. The poison was a marvel of lethal ingenuity. It was a toxin designed to be untraceable, a substance that would induce a disease that looked indigenous to Central Africa. The plan was for the victim to develop symptoms that mimicked a severe case of tularemia or anthrax, a high fever, paralysis, and then, within hours, a fatal heart attack. An autopsy, if one were even performed in the chaotic hospitals of Leopoldville, would reveal no foul play. The official cause of death would be a tragic but perfectly plausible natural illness. It was the perfect murder weapon for an agency obsessed with plausible deniability. In late September 1960, under the codename Operation Wizard Absorb, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb himself was dispatched as the courier. He packed his lethal concoction into a diplomatic pouch, a bag that was legally immune from customs inspection. Inside the pouch was a kit that would have made a Bond villain proud: a hypodermic syringe for direct injection, rubber gloves, a mask, and, in a touch of truly diabolical planning, a tube of poisoned toothpaste. The idea was that a CIA asset, a servant, a political aide, someone with access to Lumumba's private residence, could either inject the premier or, in a less direct but equally deadly approach, simply replace his regular tube of toothpaste. Every time he brushed his teeth, he would be ingesting a small cumulative dose of the toxin. Gottlieb flew to Leopoldville and personally delivered this kill kit to the CIA station chief, Larry Devlin. Devlin was a seasoned, hard-nosed field officer, a man who understood the brutal realities of the Cold War. But even for him, this was a shocking development. He had been working to undermine Lumumba politically, to fund his rivals, to spread disinformation. Now, he was being handed a box of poison from headquarters and being told in no uncertain terms to arrange for the assassination of a head of government. The official cable traffic authorizing such an action would have been couched in the cryptic, sanitized language of the intelligence world. Classified memo cable top secret eyes only to Leo Station Chief, Devlin, from DDP, Bissell, HQ. Ref, Project Wizard Absorb. A special courier codenamed Joe from Paris, Gottlieb, will arrive on or about 26 Sep with sensitive diplomatic materials for your attention. You will be provided with a set of tools to address the high-priority political problem we have discussed. A final resolution is now considered an urgent operational necessity. The consequences of failure to neutralize the target are viewed here as extremely grave. This initiative has been granted the highest possible approval. Acknowledge receipt and await instructions for the deployment of the medical supplies. This is the truly devastating reality of Operation Wizard Absorb. It reveals a level of moral depravity that goes beyond mere geopolitical maneuvering. The United States government, from the president on down, had sanctioned a plot that belonged in the pages of a medieval conspiracy. The fact that the poison was never successfully administered, Devlin and his agents could never get close enough to Lumumba under the right circumstances, is almost irrelevant. The order was given. The weapon was created. The assassin scientist was dispatched. It represents a moral point of no return, a moment when the self-proclaimed leader of the free world adopted the methods of the most ruthless totalitarian regimes. It demonstrates a complete and utter contempt for international law, for national sovereignty, and for basic human morality. In the paranoid high-stakes calculus of the Cold War, the first democratically elected leader of the Congo was seen as nothing more than a pest, a specimen to be clinically and secretly exterminated. Poisoned to the man, you could simply take away his power, strand him, and let others do the dirty work for you. And the key to this strategy was an ambitious, calculating Congolese army colonel, whom Lumumba himself had promoted and trusted, Joseph Désiré Mobutu. By early September 1960, the political situation in the capital was reaching a breaking point. The fragile coalition government that had been formed in the run-up to independence had completely fractured. The conservative president, Joseph Kasavubu, who had always been wary of Lumumba's radical nationalism, saw an opportunity. Encouraged and advised by his contacts in the Belgian and American embassies, Kasavubu went on the radio on September 5th and announced he was dismissing Patrice Lumumba as prime minister. Lumumba, never one to back down, immediately went on the air himself, declared Kasavubu a traitor, and announced that the president was deposed. The country was plunged into a constitutional crisis. It now had two rival leaders, each claiming legitimacy, each with their own block of support in a paralyzed parliament. This was not chaos. This was opportunity. For CIA Station Chief Larry Devlin, watching the meltdown from his embassy perch, this power vacuum was the moment he had been waiting for. The man he had been carefully cultivating for weeks was the Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Mobutu. Mobutu was the perfect candidate for a Western-backed strongman. He was a former journalist, intelligent, articulate, and he projected an aura of professional, non-political discipline. He was fiercely anti-communist, and most importantly, he was deeply ambitious and receptive to American guidance and support. While Lumumba was looking to Moscow, Mobutu was talking to Langley. The coup that took place on the evening of September 14, 1960, was not some spontaneous act of a patriot soldier fed up with politicians. It was a carefully managed and CIA-facilitated maneuver. Larry Devlin and his team didn't just observe the coup, they were its silent partners. Their first and most crucial contribution was money. In a country where the government was bankrupt, the CIA provided Mobutu with the cash, suitcases full of it, to pay the soldiers of the Leopoldville garrison. An army's loyalty is rarely ideological, it is logistical. By ensuring Mobutu's troops got paid when Lumumba's government couldn't manage it, the CIA bought their allegiance. Their second contribution was strategic and technical support. Devlin acted as Mobutu's unofficial political advisor. The CIA helped him draft the speech he would deliver to the nation. They provided him with intelligence on which political and military figures were loyal to Lumumba. They helped coordinate the movements of his troops as they seized the strategic prizes of any modern coup: the airport, the post office, and, most critically, the national radio station. At 8:30 p.m., Mobutu's voice crackled across the airwaves. He announced that the army was undertaking a peaceful revolution to break the deadlock between the politicians. He declared that both Lumumba and Kasavubu were being neutralized until the crisis was resolved. To give his power grab a veneer of technocratic respectability, he announced he was suspending parliament and handing over the administration of the country to a college of commissioners, a group of young university-educated Congolese. This was a brilliant piece of public relations. It didn't look like a brutish military takeover. It looked like a responsible, temporary intervention to save the nation from itself. But everyone in the know understood exactly what it was. The West had its man in charge. The self-congratulatory tone of the cable that Larry Devlin would have sent back to headquarters that night tells the real story. Classified memo cable. Top secret eyes only to DDP Bissell, HQ from Leo Station Chief Devlin. Subject: Operation High Tower. Successful execution, asset GT Gentile, a plausible code name for Mobutu, has taken effective control of the capital. Political neutralization of primary leadership announced at 2030 local. Key installations secured by his forces without significant incident. Our financial support proved critical in ensuring garrison loyalty at the decisive moment. Technical and advisory assistance was well received and implemented effectively. The Lumumba problem for the moment has been politically neutralized, pending a more permanent resolution. The College of Commissioners is our own creation and will be highly responsive to our guidance. A good night's work has been done. This was the devastating long-term legacy of Mobutu's first coup. It was the moment the United States, through the CIA, actively and decisively subverted the Congo's fledgling democracy. They didn't just choose a side in a political dispute. They armed, funded, and directed a military officer to overthrow the entire constitutional order. This act established the fatal precedent for military intervention in politics that would define and torment the Congo for the next 4 decades. They weren't saving the Congo from chaos. They were purchasing its loyalty, installing a client who would serve their interests. The coup was the first major down payment on the future Mobutu dictatorship, a regime that would be built and sustained by the very powers who now celebrated the downfall of Patrice Lumumba. Of soldiers. The outer perimeter was manned by Mobutu's troops, there to ensure he didn't escape. The inner perimeter was manned by UN peacekeepers from Ghana, who, while sympathetic to Lumumba, were under strict orders not to let him leave. He was a man with a title but no power, cut off from his allies, a prisoner in his own capital. But Lumumba was not a man to surrender. He knew that while his power in Leopoldville was gone, his popular support in the rest of the country, particularly his political heartland in the eastern city of Stanleyville, remained immense. There his loyal deputy, Antoine Gizenga, had established a rival government. a free Congolese state that refused to recognize Mobutu's military junta. Lumumba came to believe that his only hope, and the only hope for his nationalist movement, was to escape his confinement and make the perilous 2,500-mile journey to Stanleyville to lead the resistance in person. On the stormy night of November 27, 1960, he made his move. He slipped past his guards, bundled his wife and youngest child into a car, and, with a small convoy of supporters, vanished into the darkness, heading east. What followed was not a simple chase. It was a coordinated international manhunt, a grim collaboration between Mobutu's army on the ground, Western intelligence in the air, and on the wire, and most shamefully, the passive, complicit inaction of the United Nations. Mobutu, whose authority was still fragile, knew that the re-emergence of a free Lumumba in Stanleyville would trigger a full-scale civil war he might not win. He threw all of his most loyal forces into the pursuit, personally directing the operation. But he was not operating blind. The CIA station in Leopoldville became Mobutu's intelligence directorate. Larry Devlin's agents and paid informants tracked the fugitive premier's movements across the countryside. CIA provided spotter planes flew overhead, scanning the roads for his convoy. Every bit of information, a sighting at a village, a stop for fuel, a river crossing, was relayed in real time from the American embassy directly to Mobutu's headquarters. This wasn't Mobutu's army hunting a fugitive. This was a joint U.S.-Congolese operation to capture the man who was still, under constitutional law, the country's legitimate prime minister. But the final, most sickening betrayal came from the very organization that was supposed to be a neutral protector, the United Nations. During his desperate, days-long flight, Lumumba's convoy repeatedly encountered UN checkpoints manned by international peacekeepers. On several occasions, he appealed to them directly for protection, for sanctuary. Each time, he was refused. The UN commanders on the ground, hamstrung by their insane mandate of impartiality, had strict orders from their superiors. Lumumba's capture was an internal police matter for the legal authorities of the Congo, Mobutu's junta. They were not to interfere. Imagine the cold, bureaucratic language of a field report, cabled back to UN headquarters, justifying this catastrophic moral failure. Uncomfortable quote, excerpt from a field report on a Tunisian contingent Port Frankie sector. At approximately 1400 hours local time on 1st December, a convoy identified as belonging to Mr. P. Lumumba approached our checkpoint at the Sankuru River crossing, requesting safe passage and UN protection. As per Standing ONUC Directive 27B, regarding strict non-interference in the internal security matters of the host nation, my unit was instructed to remain impartial. We could not impede the legal actions of the Armée Nationale Congolaise, Mobutu's army, which is currently recognized as the state's security authority. We therefore allowed the ANC forces under Colonel Mobutu's command to pass through our checkpoint in pursuit of the convoy. We maintained our position and observed the subsequent events from a distance. We maintained our position and observed. With those few words, the UN signed Lumumba's death warrant. The capture finally came on December 1st. Lumumba's car had made it across the Sankuru River in a ferry, but the barge had to return for his wife and child. He refused to abandon them. That hesitation was fatal. As he stood on the riverbank, Mobutu's troops, having been guided by CIA intelligence and waved through UN checkpoints, closed in. He was captured, his hands tied behind his back with rope. Mobutu's men, in a spectacle clearly arranged for the waiting press, beat him brutally in front of his family. The images of the proud, defiant leader, now humiliated and broken, were flashed around the world. The devastating consequence of this capture cannot be overstated. It was the end. His political neutralization was now a physical one. The final great betrayal was not a single knife in the back, but a vast collaborative effort. The CIA provided the intelligence, Mobutu's army provided the muscle, and the United Nations provided the moral vacuum that allowed it all to happen. They stood by and watched as the legitimate head of a UN member state was hunted down like an animal. His capture wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of the final bloody page. He remained the potent symbol of Congolese nationalism, a living martyr whose name was a rallying cry for his supporters. International pressure, particularly from African and non-aligned nations, was building for his release and for the restoration of the legal government. More alarmingly for Mobutu and his Western backers, the pro-Lumumba forces in Stanleyville were gaining territory. And then, the garrison at the Thysville camp itself began to mutiny, with many of the soldiers falling back under Lumumba's charismatic sway. The situation was becoming untenable. Lumumba could not be kept alive. A public trial was out of the question. It would give him a global stage to condemn his enemies. Simply executing him in a government prison was too risky. Mobutu would bear the direct responsibility. They needed a more permanent and more deniable solution. They needed to launder the murder, and so a conference of conspirators, Mobutu's inner circle, their CIA advisors and Belgian officials, made a decision. They would send Lumumba to the one place on earth where his death was guaranteed, the secessionist, corporate state of Katanga, into the hands of his arch-nemesis, Moise Tshombe. This was not a prisoner transfer. It was a death sentence delivered by airmail. Mobutu could play the part of the jailer handing over a problematic prisoner. Tshombe and his Belgian masters in Elizabethville could play the part of the executioners. Brussels could direct the operation on the ground through its network of advisors, and Washington could maintain a comfortable distance, its fingerprints nowhere near the murder weapon. On January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba and two of his close political allies, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okido, who had been imprisoned with him, were taken from their cells. Their final journey was an ordeal of unimaginable brutality. They were put on a plane bound for Elizabethville. Throughout the flight, they were systematically beaten and tortured by their guards, in full view of the Belgian crew of the Sabena airliner. Eyewitness accounts from Belgian soldiers who later confessed paint a horrifying picture. The men were kicked, spat on, and tormented for hours, their blood staining the floor of the aircraft. By the time the plane landed in Katanga, they were barely conscious. They were not killed immediately. They were driven to a secluded house, the Villa Bru, where they were held and subjected to further torture at the hands of Katangese ministers, including the brutal Interior Minister Godefroy Munongo and their ever-present Belgian security officials. The final decision to kill them was a cold bureaucratic one. It was a political problem that needed to be erased. Consider the conversation that took place. The quiet, pragmatic advice offered by a Belgian security advisor to his Katangese political masters. Uncomfortable. Quote, a Belgian security advisor, speaking to Moise Tshombe and Godefroy Munongo. Mr. President, gentlemen, let us be practical. His continued existence is a political liability of the highest order. A trial is a platform for his propaganda. His imprisonment is a beacon for his supporters and a source of international pressure. The Americans in Leopoldville want this problem solved permanently. Mobutu has delivered the package to your doorstep. It is our responsibility for the security and stability of the new state of Katanga to ensure this package is properly disposed of. There is no other logical outcome. It is an unfortunate but unavoidable necessity of statecraft. Late that night, the three broken men were bundled into the back of a convoy of trucks and driven out into the savannah, into the darkness. They were taken to a remote clearing near a tall tree. They were dragged out, stood up, and executed by a Katangese firing squad. But this was not some chaotic act of revenge by undisciplined soldiers. It was a formal, state-sanctioned execution. And the damning, irrefutable fact confirmed decades later by Belgian parliamentary inquiries is this. The firing squad was under the direct command of a white European officer, a Belgian captain named Julian Gat. At least 4 other Belgian police and military officers were present, supervising the killings. This was not an African-on-African crime. This was a Belgian-run execution on African soil. The devastating consequence was the physical elimination of the Congo's first and only democratically elected leader. But the crime was compounded by the elaborate cover-up that followed. For 3 weeks, the world did not know Lumumba was dead. Tshombe's government kept his murder a secret. Then, in February, they announced a brazen lie to the world. Lumumba, they claimed, had escaped from custody and had been found and killed by enraged anti-Lumumbist villagers. To destroy the evidence, Belgian police officers later dug up the bodies, hacked them to pieces, and dissolved them in sulfuric acid. It was a crime designed to be erased from the physical and historical record. But the truth of that night in the Katanga's darkness, the night of the assassins, would eventually, inevitably, claw its way into the light, Hammarskjöld, of direct complicity in the murder. For Hammarskjöld, this was the darkest moment of his career. The United Nations had been present in the Congo with a massive peacekeeping force, and yet it had been utterly powerless to protect the nation's democratically elected leader from being kidnapped, tortured, and executed. It was a moment of profound institutional failure. And in that failure, something inside the cautious, scrupulously impartial diplomat seemed to break. The murder of Patrice Lumumba transformed Dag Hammarskjöld. He saw the killing not just as a tragedy, but as a contemptuous assault on the very concept of international law and the authority of the United Nations. He realized that the cancer that was poisoning the Congo, the chaos, the political instability, the murder, all stemmed from a single source: the illegal corporate-funded secession of Katanga. He had tried diplomacy. He had tried impartiality. He had tried to mediate. Now, he concluded, the only remaining option was force. The time for peacekeeping was over. It was time for war. This personal conviction was swiftly translated into political action. On February 21, 1961, reeling from the global outrage over Lumumba's death, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 161. This was a document with teeth. It was a radical departure from the toothless mandates that had hamstrung the UN mission for months. For the first time, the resolution authorized ONU to use all appropriate measures, including the use of force, if necessary, in the last resort, to prevent civil war and secure the withdrawal and evacuation of all foreign personnel. This was the legal green light Hammarskjöld had been waiting for. The phrases "all foreign military and paramilitary personnel," "political advisors," and "mercenaries" were diplomatic code. Everyone knew they meant the Belgian officers commanding the Katanga gendarmerie and the European soldiers of fortune who were flocking to Tshombe's banner. This was an incredibly high-stakes gamble. Dag Hammarskjöld was no longer trying to mediate the crisis. He was actively taking a side. He was aligning the full military and moral force of the United Nations with the central government in Leopoldville against the secessionist state. In doing so, he was putting himself on a direct collision course not just with Moise Tshombe, but with the immensely powerful forces propping him up. He was challenging the board of directors of Union Minière. He was challenging the government of Belgium, which still had hundreds of its citizens unofficially running Katanga, and he was challenging powerful factions within the governments of Britain, France, and Rhodesia, who saw the stable, anti-communist, business-friendly state of Katanga as a vital strategic asset in a turbulent Africa. The UN mission on the ground began to transform. It was no longer a passive observation force. It started to look like an army preparing for an invasion. Hammarskjöld and his commanders began to build up their military strength, requesting and receiving tougher, more battle-hardened contingents of troops: elite Irish battalions, Swedish commandos, fearsome Nepalese Gurkhas. They brought in combat aircraft for the first time, jet fighters that could challenge Katanga's small mercenary-piloted air force. They deployed armored cars and heavy mortars. The objective was no longer to keep a non-existent peace. The objective was compulsion. This new, aggressive posture sent shockwaves through the Western diplomatic community, who saw their carefully managed crisis spinning out of their control. The man they had hoped would be a pliable administrator was becoming a crusader. Uncomfortable quote, top secret cipher from the British ambassador Leopoldville to the Foreign Office, London. The Secretary General's recent interpretation of Resolution 161 is deeply and profoundly concerning. He is no longer acting as a neutral arbiter in this affair, but as a militant enforcer for the central government's agenda. His newfound obsession with expelling all European advisors from Katanga is a direct threat to the viability of President Tshombe's administration, which, I must remind you, remains our most reliable partner and the only guarantor of stability for British and Allied corporate interests in the region. Hammarskjöld is becoming a rogue actor, pursuing a personal moral crusade that recklessly jeopardizes vital Western economic and strategic objectives. He must be reined in before he does irreparable damage. This was the devastating unintended consequence of Hammarskjöld's principled stand. In deciding to save the Congo, he had made himself the single greatest obstacle to the strategic and financial plans of some of the most powerful governments and corporations on Earth. He was no longer a useful international civil servant managing a difficult problem. He was now a threat. By declaring war on the neo-colonial project in Katanga, he had inadvertently painted a massive target on his own back. The very same forces that had conspired to neutralize and eliminate Patrice Lumumba now had a new enemy, an even more formidable one, sitting in the office of the Secretary General of the United Nations, of neo-colonial power, the white mercenary. On the surface, these men were soldiers of fortune, romantic adventurers, the wild geese and dogs of war fighting for pay and excitement. But the uncomfortable truth is that the mercenaries who flocked to defend Katanga were not simply rogue individuals. Their recruitment, arming, and deployment was a quiet but deliberate instrument of foreign policy, a deniable proxy force used by Belgium, and tacitly supported by interests in Britain, France, Rhodesia, and South Africa, to wage war against the United Nations without ever officially declaring it. They came from the fading embers of Europe's colonial empires. There were French paratroopers, hardened veterans of the brutal counterinsurgency wars in Algeria and Indochina, men like the infamous Bob Denard. There were former British officers who had fought in Malaya and Kenya, professional soldiers with no wars left to fight. There were Belgians who had served in the Force Publique and felt a bitter paternalistic loyalty to their former colony. And there were a large number of Rhodesians and South Africans, men for whom fighting against a UN-backed black nationalist cause was a defense of their own white supremacist ideology. They weren't fighting for Katanga. They were fighting for a world that was rapidly disappearing. Their recruitment was not a haphazard affair. It was managed through a shadowy network of intermediaries in the capitals of Europe. Discreet offices were set up in Brussels and Paris, often run by former intelligence officers or far-right political activists. Veterans associations and military old boys clubs became fertile recruiting grounds. A man with the right experience could be approached in a bar, offered a tax-free contract worth many times a regular soldier's salary, and within weeks find himself on a flight to Elizabethville, his passport stamped with a visa identifying him as a technician or a mining consultant. This pipeline was greased by the silent complicity of Western intelligence agencies, who could lose a file, expedite a passport, and ensure that transport planes chartered by front companies were not subject to rigorous inspection. In Katanga, these men were not just extra riflemen. They were the elite. They provided the military expertise that Tshombe's army lacked. They became the commanders of the gendarmerie battalions, planning ambushes and leading attacks against UN positions. They were the pilots of Katanga's tiny but lethal air force, the Luftkat, flying French-made Fouga Magister jets, trainer aircraft that had been cunningly converted into deadly ground attack planes to strafe and bomb UN columns. They were the specialists, the mortar crews, the demolition experts. They gave the Katangese forces a hard, professional edge that the often lightly armed UN peacekeepers struggled to counter. The entire enterprise was built on the principle of plausible deniability. This was its genius and its deep cynicism. When the Irish UN contingent at Jadoville was besieged and forced to surrender, they were fighting Katangese gendarmes led by European mercenaries. When UN supply lines were cut, it was by demolition teams led by mercenaries. But if any of these men were captured or killed, the governments in Brussels, Paris, or London could express shock and dismay. They were not official soldiers, you see. They were private citizens, uncontrollable adventurers. This cynical arrangement is laid bare in the kind of back-channel conversations that took place between the Belgian government and the corporation that was footing the bill. Uncomfortable quote, a conversation between a senior Belgian foreign ministry official and a Union Minière director. Belgian official: "We cannot send a single uniformed soldier into Katanga. It is politically impossible. Hammarskjöld is watching our every move and is just waiting for an excuse to condemn us before the entire world. UMHK Director, we don't need your soldiers, we need your ex-soldiers. Open the personnel files from the parachute commandos, the veterans of the Kamina base. Pass the names to the recruiting agency on the Rue Royale. The company will fund their generous employment contracts through a holding company in Liechtenstein. Their passports will identify them as mining technicians. Officially, you will know absolutely nothing about it. And we will have our army. This was the devastating consequence of the mercenary strategy. It internationalized the conflict on a new, insidious level and dramatically raised the stakes for the UN. Dag Hammarskjöld wasn't just facing a local rebellion anymore. He was facing a professional multinational proxy army, funded by one of the world's richest corporations and staffed by veterans of Europe's dirtiest wars. The privatization of warfare had begun. This guaranteed that the UN's new forceful mandate would not lead to a quick police action. It would lead to a real bloody war, fought against the deniable dogs of war of the old empires. Move into Katanga in force, arrest the entire mercenary leadership, and forcibly expel all foreign military advisors, thereby breaking the back of Tshombe's army. The operation was a shock to the system. UN troops, led by Irish and Swedish battalions, seized strategic points in Elizabethville, but the mercenaries and the gendarmerie, led by men like Bob Denard, fought back with surprising ferocity. The UN's police action descended into brutal street-to-street fighting. The UN was now undeniably at war. With the fighting deadlocked and a full-scale conflagration imminent, Dag Hammarskjöld did what he had always done. He took personal responsibility. Believing he could still achieve a breakthrough through direct diplomacy, he decided to fly to the region to negotiate a ceasefire face-to-face with Moise Tshombe. The meeting was arranged to take place on neutral ground in the city of Ndola, in the neighboring British colony of Northern Rhodesia, a territory whose white settler government and business community were deeply sympathetic to the Katangese cause. It was, in retrospect, a meeting in the Lion's Den. On the evening of September 17, 1961, Hammarskjöld and his team boarded a Swedish-crewed DC-6 aircraft, the Albertina, for the flight from Leopoldville to Ndola. The flight was undertaken with extreme caution. They flew at night, maintaining strict radio silence, taking a long circuitous route over Lake Tanganyika to avoid flying directly over Katangese airspace, where they knew at least one mercenary-piloted Fuga Magister jet was operating. Just after midnight on September 18th, the Albertina made contact with the control tower at Ndola, reporting its position and its intention to descend for landing. Then nothing. The plane vanished from the sky. The crash that killed Dag Hammarskjöld and all 15 people aboard his plane was officially, for decades, ruled an accident, the result of pilot error, but the evidence, suppressed at the time and unearthed over 60 years of painstaking investigation, tells a different story. The official narrative was a lie, a cover-up for the political murder of the one man who dared to enforce international law against the combined might of corporate greed and colonial intransigence. Consider the evidence from this cold case. First, the eyewitnesses, multiple African charcoal burners working in the forest near the crash site, reported the same thing to the first Rhodesian police investigators on the scene. They saw a second, smaller aircraft approach the big plane. Their testimony was initially recorded, then dismissed and buried by the official colonial inquiry. Second, the lone survivor. The chief of security on the flight, Harold Julian, was found alive in the wreckage, though horrifically burned. Before he died in a Rhodesian hospital 5 days later, he spoke to doctors and nurses. His last, semi-conscious words were not about a technical failure. He spoke of sparks in the sky and a sudden explosion just before the plane went down. Third, the inexplicable delay in the search and rescue operation. The plane was expected to land at Ndola just after midnight. When it failed to arrive, no alarm was raised for hours. A full-scale search was not launched until after sunrise more than 9 hours later. The crash site was eventually located just 9 miles from the airport. It was an act of gross, almost deliberate negligence. And finally, the most chilling evidence, intercepted radio signals. Declassified American intelligence documents confirm that the NSA had a listening post in Cyprus that was monitoring radio traffic in the region that night. Recent investigations have uncovered transcripts of what appears to be a mercenary pilot flying a Katangese Fuga jet, reporting on his attack. Operation Morthor in its tracks and ended, for a time, the UN's will to fight. The death of the Secretary General was a message, sent in fire and twisted metal to the entire world. There are lines you do not cross. There are corporate empires and political projects that are sacrosanct. The one man who truly believed in the power of international law over the law of the jungle had been silenced forever, his plane crashing in the African darkness. Decades of official inquiries into the death of Dag Hammarskjöld would follow, but their purpose, it seems, was not to find the truth, but to expertly bury it under an impenetrable mountain of bureaucracy. The original sin of this cover-up was the very first investigation, the one conducted on site by the British colonial authorities of Northern Rhodesia. This was not an impartial inquiry. The Rhodesian government, led by the pro-settler politician Roy Walensky, was openly hostile to the UN mission and a staunch supporter of Moise Tshombe's secessionist Katanga. They were, in effect, allowing the fox to investigate the disappearance of the chickens. The commission was a masterclass in reaching a predetermined conclusion. The testimony of the African charcoal burners, the only eyewitnesses to the plane's final moments, was systematically discredited. These men, who consistently told the police they saw a second, smaller plane and heard shots, were dismissed as simple, uneducated natives, prone to superstition and fantasy. The physical evidence was handled with similar, deliberate negligence. The wreckage was not properly secured. The bodies of the victims, including Hammarskjöld's, were not subjected to thorough autopsies that could have detected bullet fragments or shrapnel from an explosion. The cryptic dying words of the lone survivor, Harold Julian, were downplayed. The commission's focus was narrowed obsessively onto one possibility: pilot error. They built a narrative that the pilots had become disoriented and simply flown the plane into the ground. It was a clean, simple, technical explanation. And most importantly, it was an explanation that implicated no one. It absolved the British authorities of their failure to mount a timely rescue. It absolved the Katangese secessionists. It absolved their mercenary pilots and their powerful international backers. Subsequent inquiries, even those conducted by the United Nations, were hopelessly compromised from the start. They were forced to rely on the evidence collected and filtered by the Rhodesians. When later investigators asked to see crucial documents, intelligence intercepts from the night of the crash, lists of mercenaries operating in the area, full witness statements, they were met with a wall of silence. The intelligence agencies of the major powers, America's CIA, Britain's MI6, Belgium's Sûreté de l'État, refused to open their archives, citing the eternal excuse of national security. The intent to control the narrative from the very beginning is palpable in the communications of the men on the ground. Imagine the cable sent from the British governor in Northern Rhodesia back to his superiors in London, just as the scale of the incident became clear. Classified memo, cipher top secret from Governor Lusaka to Colonial Office London. Subject: the Ndola incident. Urgent. The wreckage has been located. The Swede is confirmed dead. The political sensitivity of this situation cannot possibly be overstated. A local commission of inquiry will be established immediately under our full authority. It is absolutely imperative that we control the process, the witnesses, and the final conclusions. The official narrative must be focused on technical failure or pilot incapacitation. Any serious consideration of external hostile action, particularly given the proximity to Katanga, would have catastrophic diplomatic and economic consequences for our regional allies and our own interests. The local witness testimony is problematic and will be handled with appropriate discretion. Rest assured, we will manage this. We will manage this. And they did. For over half a century, the official story held. The assassination of a sitting UN Secretary General was successfully passed off as an unfortunate accident. The devastating long-term consequence of this masterful cover-up is the profound impunity it granted to the perpetrators. It demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that a political murder of the highest magnitude, an act of war against the international community itself, could be successfully hidden by the very states that claimed to be the guardians of world order. It proved that national security was a code word for a license to kill and to lie. The truth about who gave the order, who was in the cockpit of that second plane, and who helped bury the evidence didn't just die with Dag Hammarskjöld on that hillside near Ndola. It was deliberately and systematically interred in the locked archives and sealed vaults of Washington, London, and Brussels, a permanent monument to the thin veil of plausible deniability. Having weathered the storm and seen its greatest adversary eliminated, was secure. But the fundamental instability of the situation remained a festering sore on the world stage. And in Washington, a new administration was coming to a new, colder, and more pragmatic conclusion. The Eisenhower administration had been content with a policy of containment and tacit support for the Katangese breakaway. But the Kennedy administration, which took office in 1961, saw the world through a different lens. They were less sentimental about the old European colonial arrangements and more ruthlessly focused on the global Cold War chessboard. To them, the ongoing Katanga secession was a disaster. It was a source of constant instability. It made the West look like imperialist hypocrites, and most dangerously, it legitimized the rival, pro-Lumumbist government in Stanleyville, which was attracting support and sympathy from the Soviet bloc. Kennedy and his advisors, men like Undersecretary of State George Ball, decided that a messy, fragmented Congo was a liability. A unified Congo, under a strong, reliable, pro-Western central government, was a much more effective bulwark against communism. Their chosen instrument for this new policy was the central government in Leopoldville, now led by Prime Minister Cyril Adula. But everyone knew the real power behind Adula's throne was the man who controlled the army, Colonel Joseph Mobutu. The new American strategy was simple: back the central government, give the UN a new and even stronger mandate to end the secession by any means necessary, and reunify the country under their chosen strongman. The Chombe experiment was over. In December 1962, the UN, now with the full political, financial, and logistical backing of the United States, launched its final, decisive offensive, Operation Grand Slam. This was not the hesitant, ill-fated push of 1961. This was a full-scale military invasion. UN forces, spearheaded by Indian Gurkhas and equipped with heavy armor and overwhelming air support, smashed through the Katangese lines. The mercenaries, outgunned, and knowing their powerful international backers had abandoned them, put up a brief fight and then melted away. The corporate statelet of Moise Tshombe, which had defied the world for 2.5 years, collapsed in a matter of weeks. On January 15, 1963, Tshombe signed an agreement formally ending the secession. The Congo was, on paper, whole again. It was hailed as a great victory for the United Nations and the principle of national unity. But it was a victory steeped in the bitterest of ironies. The country had been reunified, but not for the vision of Patrice Lumumba. The wealth of Katanga would no longer flow into the private treasury of Moise Tshombe. Instead, the tax and royalty payments from Union Minière would now be directed to the central government in Leopoldville. But the fundamental arrangement remained unchanged. The vast profits from the mines would still flow to the shareholders in Brussels. The concessions and contracts of the great Belgian corporations were all honored by the new central government as part of the deal. The looting of the Congo had not been stopped. It had merely been centralized. This new pragmatic American approach was best summarized in the kind of frank, off-the-record briefing a State Department official might give to a concerned corporate executive. Uncomfortable. Quote, a U.S. State Department official briefing a nervous American mining executive, 1963. Look, I understand your concern, but the Tshombe experiment was a public relations nightmare. It was messy, unstable, and it made us look like we were still playing the colonial game. A unified Congo under Adula, with Mobutu running security, is a much cleaner, more efficient model for our interests. Think of it as a corporate restructuring. The tax revenue gets centralized in Leopoldville, which makes the central government politically stable and permanently dependent on our financial aid. Mobutu keeps the communists out. And your company? Your future concessions are secure. You're just writing your royalty checks to a different P.O. box now. We haven't changed the fundamental business model. We've just streamlined the management. This was the devastating long-term consequence of Katanga's fall. It did not bring peace or prosperity. It was simply the end of one chapter of exploitation and the beginning of another. It marked the transition from the old, overt, Belgian-led neo-colonial model to a new, more sophisticated American-led Cold War client state model. The dream of Patrice Lumumba, a strong, truly independent Congo that used its own immense wealth for the benefit of its own people, was now definitively dead and buried. The war for Katanga was over, but the misery of the Congo was just beginning. Now it would be a unified, centralized misery, managed from a single capital and enforced by a strongman handpicked in Washington, rise from its unmarked grave. The nationalist fire that Lumumba had lit was not extinguished. It had been smoldering in the eastern provinces, and in 1964, it erupted into a conflagration that threatened to burn the entire client state to the ground. This was the Simba Rebellion. In the Western press, it was almost universally portrayed as a descent into atavistic savagery. Crazed, drug-fueled tribal warriors, practicing black magic and massacring civilians. And while the rebellion was undeniably brutal, this racist caricature was a deliberate and self-serving lie. The uncomfortable truth is that the Simba Rebellion was a direct and legitimate political successor to Patrice Lumumba's nationalist movement. It was a widespread, popular, and politically coherent uprising against the corrupt central government in Leopoldville and its foreign masters. The leaders of the rebellion were not tribal chiefs. They were Lumumba's political heirs, men like Christophe Gbenye and Pierre Mulele, who had served in Lumumba's government and led the breakaway Stanleyville regime, organized the revolt. They tapped into a deep well of popular rage. Rage over the murder of the nation's hero, rage against the corrupt and ineffective officials installed by Mobutu, and rage against the continued domination of the country's economy by foreign interests. Their message was simple and powerful. The revolution had been betrayed, and it was time to reclaim it. The foot soldiers of this new revolution were the Simbas, the Swahili word for lions. They were a potent, if unorthodox, mix of soldiers from the former Stanleyville Army and a mass of young rural recruits armed with little more than spears, machetes, and a burning sense of injustice. To compensate for their lack of modern weaponry, they embraced a powerful psychological tool: magic. Their shamans, or fetisheurs, gave them a dawa, a magical protection that they believed would turn enemy bullets into water. Chanting Mai Mulele, water of Mulele, they would charge into battle, convinced of their own invincibility. To their Western opponents, this was proof of their primitive nature. In reality, it was a desperate but effective way to forge a fearless, highly motivated guerrilla army from nothing. The success of this army was staggering. In the spring and summer of 1964, the Simbas swept across the entire eastern half of the Congo. The National Army, the Armée Nationale Congolaise, or ANC, the same army built by Mobutu, proved to be a paper tiger. Lacking morale, leadership, and popular support, its soldiers often dropped their weapons and fled in terror from the seemingly invincible Simba warriors. By August, the rebels had captured Stanleyville, the nation's third largest city. They declared it the capital of their new People's Republic of the Congo. In less than 6 months, the ghost of Lumumba had reclaimed almost half the country. The speed and scale of the rebellion sent a wave of absolute panic through the corridors of power in Washington and Brussels. Their carefully constructed post-Lumumba framework, their stable and unified Congo, was disintegrating before their eyes. Their man, Mobutu, and his army were being humiliated. This was their worst-case scenario: a popular, ideologically charged, and successful nationalist insurgency, chanting the name of the man they had conspired to murder. The frantic tone of the intelligence assessments being cabled back to Langley tells the story of this panic. Classified memo. Intelligence assessment eyes only from CIA Station Chief, Leopoldville to Director, CIA. Date, 5 August 1964. Subject, Urgent Threat Assessment, Eastern Rebellion. The Simba phenomenon is spreading faster than any of our projections. This is not disorganized tribalism. We are witnessing a politically coherent, well-led, and dangerously popular Lumumbist insurgency. They have taken Stanleyville. The ANC has effectively collapsed as a fighting force in the east. We are now facing the very real possibility that our entire post-Lumumba framework for this country could be overthrown within weeks, not months. Rebel broadcasts are invoking Lumumba's name, and there are credible reports of covert support from Chinese and Soviet bloc sources via Burundi. Sir, this is a 5-alarm fire. This was the devastating consequence of the Simba Rebellion. It was a raw, violent, and undeniable popular verdict on the failure of the Western project in the Congo. The peace imposed by Mobutu was revealed to be so hollow and so hated by the populace that it shattered at the first serious challenge. The rebellion, born directly from the unexorcised ghost of Patrice Lumumba, would now provoke an even more brutal and overt international intervention than anything that had come before. To save their client state from the righteous anger of its own people, the United States and Belgium would have to drop all pretense and intervene directly, this time under the thinnest, most cynical veil of humanitarianism imaginable. Cornered and increasingly desperate Simbas in Stanleyville made a fatal error. They rounded up the entire white population of the city, hundreds of Belgian and American missionaries, doctors, teachers, businessmen, and the American consular staff, and declared them hostages. They were to be used as human shields, bargaining chips to hold off the advancing mercenary army. This was a brutal, inexcusable act. It was also, for Washington and Brussels, a golden opportunity. The hostage crisis was a public relations gift. The complex political narrative of a post-colonial civil war, of a popular Lumumbist uprising against a corrupt junta, was instantly erased. It was replaced by a simple, powerful, and deeply racist story that any Western audience could understand. Innocent white civilians, including women and children, were being held captive by savage black rebels. This was the perfect pretext, the unimpeachable humanitarian justification for the massive, direct military intervention they had been itching to launch. The operation, codenamed Dragon Rouge, was a marvel of logistical and military power. In November 1964, a fleet of American C-130 transport aircraft, flown by U.S. Air Force crews, flew a battalion of elite Belgian paratroopers from their base in Europe to the Congo. On the morning of November 24th, they dropped from the sky directly onto the airfield at Stanleyville. Simultaneously, a second, smaller operation, Dragon Noir, was launched against the town of Paulus. The world watched, holding its breath, as the media hailed a daring and heroic rescue mission. But the famed Belgo-American hostage rescue was a PR spectacle, a humanitarian fig leaf masking the operation's true and brutal objective: to crush the Simba Rebellion once and for all and secure Mobutu's teetering regime. The proof lies in the operational priorities. This was not a delicate scalpel-like rescue. It was a sledgehammer assault. The paratroopers were not special forces trained for hostage situations. They were a frontline combat unit. Their mission was to seize and hold a hostile city. Let's be clear about the cold, pragmatic briefing that would have been given to the Belgian commanders by their American logistical partners before they boarded the planes. Uncomfortable quote from a U.S. Air Force planner's briefing to the Belgian paracommando leadership. Gentlemen, let's be absolutely clear on the rules of engagement here. This is a military operation with a humanitarian component, not the other way around. Your first priority upon landing is the aggressive seizure and securing of the airfield, the post office, and the Radio Stanleyville building. You are to neutralize all organized Simba resistance. The rebel political and military leadership cadres are your primary targets. The extraction of the European and American non-combatants is a secondary objective, to be executed only once the city's strategic points are under your complete control. We cannot allow the hostage situation to dictate military necessity. The strategic objective is to break this rebellion permanently, and that is exactly what they did. The paratroopers fought their way into the city, not as rescuers but as invaders, and their arrival triggered the very bloodbath the mission was supposedly meant to prevent. As the first paratroopers landed, panicked Simba guards, realizing the game was up, began to execute hostages at the Victoria Hotel. Dozens were machine-gunned down before the Belgian soldiers could reach them. The rescue came too late. But the true horror came in the aftermath of the liberation. As the paratroopers secured the city center and evacuated the remaining Europeans, the mercenary-led ANC ground column, known as 5 Commando, finally arrived. What followed was not a restoration of order, but an orgy of revenge. These forces, along with Mobutu's army, swept through the city and the surrounding areas, engaging in a weeks-long massacre. Thousands of Congolese, anyone suspected of being a Simba, of sympathizing with the Simbas, or often, simply anyone who was educated and could be seen as a future political threat, were rounded up and summarily executed. The Stanleyville that was saved by Operation Dragon Rouge became the site of one of the most vicious bloodbaths of the entire Congo Crisis. This is the devastating hidden legacy of the famed operation. It was a stunning public relations success. It was hailed around the world as a triumph of Western courage and military prowess, but it was a lie. It was a cynical, war-winning military operation disguised as an act of mercy. It shattered the last organized remnants of Lumumba's nationalist dream. It cemented the power of Mobutu and his deeply unpopular regime. And it served as the catalyst for the slaughter of countless thousands of the very Congolese people the world claimed to be helping. The hostages were not the mission, they were the excuse. The dictator, to its own rescue, remained hopelessly corrupt, weak, and paralyzed by a new round of bitter infighting between President Kasavubu and his new prime minister. In a truly bizarre twist of political fortune, the pardoned and returned former secessionist Moise Tshombe. For the Congo's patrons in Washington, this political theater was tiresome. They had just won a war for this government, and now it was squabbling over the spoils. The time for unreliable politicians was over. It was time for a permanent solution. It was time for a king. On November 25, 1965, the commander of the army, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, launched his second coup d'état. It was a quiet, bloodless, and almost seamless affair. There were no tanks in the streets, no shots fired. Mobutu simply went on the radio, as he had done 5 years earlier, and announced that he was taking control. Citing the failure of the politicians, he declared that he was dismissing both the president and the prime minister, and that the army would assume power for a period of 5 years to restore order, stability, and economic discipline. But this was not just another military takeover in a turbulent post-colonial world. This was the planned, calculated culmination of 5 years of American policy in the Congo. The West, and particularly the United States, didn't just tacitly support Mobutu's second coup. They had willed it into existence. They had spent half a decade cultivating him, funding him, and advising him. He was the CIA's most valuable asset in Africa. He had proven his anti-communist credentials. He had proven his loyalty. He had proven, with their help, that he was the only man who could command the army and impose the kind of absolute stability that Western business and strategic interests required. The coup wasn't a surprise. It was a coronation. The true scandal lies in what happened next. The normal international response to a military coup against a civilian government is condemnation, sanctions, a suspension of aid. The response to Mobutu's coup was the exact opposite, a coordinated, international campaign to instantly manufacture his legitimacy. The United States extended diplomatic recognition to his new military regime with almost indecent haste. Foreign aid from Washington, which had been tangled in bureaucracy under the civilian government, was suddenly unfrozen and dramatically increased. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions where the U.S. held decisive influence, quickly stepped in with massive loans to prop up his new government. This was accompanied by a sophisticated public relations campaign. In the Western media and in diplomatic circles, a new narrative was spun. Mobutu was not a thuggish military dictator who had overthrown a democracy. No, he was a modernizer. He was a stabilizing force. He was the father of the nation who had bravely stepped in to save his country from chaos and the creeping threat of communism. It was a deliberate, cynical, and fantastically successful effort to create a respectable public image for their new client. The cold, pragmatic logic behind this strategy is the kind of thing that is never said in public, but is codified in internal policy documents. Classified Memo, U.S. State Department Internal Policy Memorandum. Subject: Congo policy following change in government, November 1965. The recent assumption of power by General Mobutu, while constitutionally irregular, should be viewed as a profoundly positive development for long-term U.S. strategic interests in Central Africa. This action removes the unreliable and perpetually factional civilian politicians and centralizes authority in a single pro-Western and provenly anti-communist figure. Our policy must be to provide immediate, unconditional, and highly visible support to his new regime. This includes rapid diplomatic recognition, the unfreezing of all economic aid packages, and a coordinated public affairs effort to frame him in the international press as a necessary force for national unity and stability. We must invest in his success, as his success is now synonymous with ours in the region. He is, for all intents and purposes, our man. This was the devastating long-term consequence of Mobutu's final coronation. It was a devil's bargain, made with eyes wide open. The West got exactly what it wanted: 32 years of absolute stability, an unwavering anti-Soviet ally in the heart of Africa, and uninterrupted access to the Congo's vast mineral wealth. The price for this was paid, in blood and treasure, by the Congolese people. They were handed over to one of the most durable, oppressive, and rapacious kleptocracies of the 20th century. The United States and its allies didn't just support a dictator. They built him, financed him, armed him, and defended him for 3 decades. The Congo Crisis, which had begun with the murder of a patriot, ended with the crowning of a puppet. So vast it defies imagination. He perfected the art of kleptocracy, the rule of thieves. And the most uncomfortable truth of all is that this colossal, nation-destroying corruption was not a bug in the system the West had installed. It was the system's primary feature. It was the price the West was knowingly and willingly willing to pay. Mobutu's method was brutally simple. He erased the distinction between his personal wallet and the national treasury. He famously told his people, "The state, it is me," and he meant it literally. The country's vast mineral wealth, particularly the revenues from the newly nationalized mining giant Gécamine, the former Union Minière, flowed directly to him. He was the CEO of Zaire Inc. and the only shareholder. To maintain power, he did not rely on ideology or popular support, but on a vast, intricate network of patronage. He allowed his top generals, his government ministers, and his regional governors to engage in their own, smaller-scale looting. The unspoken motto of the regime was a cynical inversion of the social contract. "You are free to steal from the state, so long as you remain completely loyal to me, the master thief." In the early 1970s, he institutionalized this theft under the banner of Zairianization. In a supposed effort to reclaim the economy for Africans, he summarily expropriated hundreds of foreign-owned businesses, plantations, factories, shops, and handed them over, not to the state or to capable managers, but directly to his untrained and incompetent cronies. The result was a catastrophe. These new owners simply asset stripped the businesses, sold off the inventory and equipment, and let them collapse. The formal economy was destroyed, but the ruling elite became fantastically rich. While his country's infrastructure, the roads, schools, and hospitals so proudly built by the Belgians to serve their own interests, crumbled into ruin, Mobutu amassed one of the world's great personal fortunes, estimated in the billions of dollars. He built a lavish palace complex in his home village of Badalite, a Versailles in the jungle with its own international airport large enough to land the Concorde, which he would charter for shopping trips to Paris. His personal wealth, siphoned directly from the state and squirreled away in Swiss and Belgian bank accounts, was at one point estimated to be equivalent to the entirety of his nation's foreign debt. And why did the West, the champions of democracy and free markets, not only tolerate this but actively finance it? The answer is the Cold War. It was a simple, brutal transaction. In exchange for Mobutu's iron-fisted rule and spectacular theft, the United States and its allies received 4 invaluable services. 1. Mobutu was a guaranteed unwavering anti-communist vote in all international forums. 2. He kept the Congo's or Zaire's vast reserves of copper, cobalt, diamonds, and yes, uranium, flowing exclusively to Western markets. 3. He allowed the CIA to use Zaire as a massive, covert staging base for its proxy wars against Soviet-backed movements in neighboring countries, most notably Angola. 4. He was stable. His very corruption was the source of his stability. The cold, transactional nature of this relationship was an open secret in the intelligence community. Uncomfortable quote, excerpt from a 1982 CIA National Intelligence Estimate on Zaire. Subject: The Zaire Asset, a cost-benefit analysis. President Mobutu's regime is, by any conventional metric, a catastrophic failure of governance. The systemic kleptocracy is not a flaw in his system of rule. It is his system of rule. However, the costs of his corruption, while staggering, must be weighed against the tangible geopolitical benefits he provides. He provides logistical bases for our operations in Angola. He is a reliable vote against Soviet interests at the OAU and the UN. He guarantees Western access to Shaba Province's Katanga's strategic cobalt reserves. Any potential alternative to his rule is either unknown, unstable, or likely to be Marxist-aligned. Therefore, the long-standing policy conclusion remains the same. He is a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. The financial and military support must continue. This was the devastating 30-year legacy of the Congo Crisis. It institutionalized the ruin of a nation. The country's immense potential was not just squandered. It was actively strip-mined and funneled into the pockets of a tiny elite and the vaults of their Western bankers. Western aid and IMF loans poured into the country, and Mobutu and his cronies skimmed it off the top, often depositing it right back in the same Western financial institutions that had issued the loans, leaving the Congolese people saddled with the debt. The Cold War didn't just prevent the Congo from developing, it paid for and profited from its systemic destruction. Evaporated. His stolen billions could no longer buy him loyalty in Washington or Paris. In 1997, a rebellion backed by neighboring Rwanda and Uganda and led by an old, grizzled revolutionary named Laurent Désiré Kabila, a man who had fought with Che Guevara alongside the Simba rebels in the 1960s, swept across the country and drove the dying dictator into exile. It seemed for a moment as if the ghost of Lumumba had finally won. But the Congo Crisis never truly ended. It had simply mutated, metastasized, and embedded itself into the very DNA of the nation. The fall of Mobutu did not bring peace or a democratic dawn. It created a power vacuum that triggered a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. The conflict that followed, often called Africa's World War, sucked in the armies of 9 different nations and dozens of armed militias. It was a continent-spanning scramble to seize control of the immense mineral wealth that Mobutu had once monopolized. Over 5 million people perished between 1998 and 2003, the deadliest conflict anywhere in the world since World War II. The patterns of violence and extraction established in 1960 were not broken, they were amplified. And they continue to this day. The Democratic Republic of Congo remains a heartbreaking paradox, arguably the single richest piece of territory on the planet in terms of natural resources, and yet home to some of the world's poorest and most brutalized people. The minerals at the heart of the conflict have changed. The uranium that obsessed Eisenhower and Dulles has been replaced by coltan, the essential component in every smartphone and laptop. The copper that built Union Minier's fortune has been joined by cobalt, the critical element in the lithium-ion batteries that power the world's electric cars and green energy revolution. The extraction is now done by new multinational corporations, by shadowy international arms dealers, and by brutal militias who enslave local populations to work in artisanal mines. The names on the corporate letterheads have changed, but the fundamental business model remains the same. The wealth flows out and the violence stays in. This is the ultimate unpaid debt of the Congo Crisis. It is not just the billions that Mobutu stole, a financial burden that still cripples the nation. It is the theft of a nation's entire future. The decisions made in 1960 to sabotage a fledgling democracy, to assassinate its leader, to back a corporate secession, to murder a UN Secretary General, and to install a puppet dictator, were not just historical events. They were foundational acts that created a permanent, multi-generational cycle of corruption, violence, and foreign exploitation. Let's close with the imagined reflection of a retired Western intelligence officer looking back from the quiet of his study on a lifetime of covert action. Uncomfortable quote. Back then, we were told we were holding the line against communism in Africa. That was the official justification for everything. For what happened to Lumumba, for backing Mobutu, for all of it. But we weren't holding a line. We were poisoning a well for generations. We saw it as a grand chess game for the future of the free world. In reality, we were just a gang of burglars smashing up someone else's house to get at the silverware. And now, 60 years later, the house is still in ruins, the people inside are still suffering, and new gangs are still fighting over that same damn silverware. We didn't win anything in the Congo. We just broke a country, and we broke it for good. And that is the enduring, uncomfortable reality. The crisis of 1960 is not over. It is the living, breathing history of the Congo today. The ghosts of Patrice Lumumba, Dag Hammarskjöld, and the millions of unnamed victims of the conflicts that followed still walk that rich, blood-soaked earth. Their tragedy is not some inexplicable, uniquely African misfortune. It is the direct, logical, and ongoing consequence of a series of cold, cynical decisions made half a world away in the corridors of power, that valued strategic minerals and Cold War advantage over the lives and the future of a nation. The story of the Congo Crisis is a brutal lesson in how the gears of history are turned, often in secret, and always at a cost. The official narratives of decolonization and Cold War competition hide a darker reality of corporate greed, political assassination, and the deliberate sacrifice of a nation's future for strategic gain. The outcome was never truly in doubt, but the consequences, a legacy of violence, corruption, and exploitation, continue to echo from the mines of Katanga to the circuits of the smartphone in your pocket. We present these synthesized details and reconstructed conversations not for entertainment, but to reveal the paradoxes that the official histories seek to conceal. The public record is rarely the complete one. The uncomfortable reality is that the forces that tore the Congo apart in 1960 are still at play, a grim testament to the fact that the past is never truly past. Thank you for joining us on the Sleepless Dossier. If this story has opened your eyes, share it. Discuss it. Dig deeper into the files yourself. The more we question the comfortable stories we are told, the closer we get to the uncomfortable truths that shape our world. And that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.